Guten Abend und herzlich willkommen zum heutigen Webinar Revolution in der Ernährung von Katzen, Umgang mit Katzenallergenen. Wir freuen uns, dass wir heute Abend mehrere Experten aus der Humanmedizin, Allergologie, Veterinärmedizin und Immunologie zu Gast haben, die uns die neuesten Fortschritte bei der Behandlung von Katzenhaarallergien vorstellen werden. Das Webinar wird aus 4 Teilen bestehen. Wir beginnen mit dem Vortrag von Professor Dr. Peter Schmidt-Grendelmeier. Er ist Facharzt für Allergologie und Dermatologie und leitet seit 2003 die Abteilung für Allergologie an der Dermatologischen Klinik des Universitätsspitals Zürich. Er verfügt über eine langjährige Erfahrung in der klinischen Patientenversorgung, die er sowohl in der Schweiz als auch in tropischen Regionen, zum Beispiel Tansania, gesammelt hat. Er hat auch umfangreiche Erfahrung in der translationalen Forschung, die Umsetzung wissenschaftlicher Erkenntnisse in medizinische Behandlungen und in der Ausbildung von medizinischem und paramedizinischem Personal. Professor Dr. Grendelmeier wird den ersten Teil präsentieren, Katzenallergie, eine häufige Ursache für Atemwegsallergien bei Menschen. Im zweiten Teil hören wir von Dr. Andy Sparks, PhD, Graduate of the European College of Veterinary Internal Medicine, Member of the Australian and New Zealand College of Veterinary Scientists, Member of the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons. Dr. Sparks ist ein unabhängiger Fachberater, der sich auf Katzenmedizin spezialisiert hat. Sein Vortrag wird die Mensch- und Tierbindung erforschen und Daten über die körperlichen und geistigen Gesundheitsvorteile der Tierbegleitung präsentieren. Anschließend wird er über die Auswirkungen der Katzenallergie auf das Wohlbefinden der Katzen und ihre Beziehung zum Menschen sprechen. Es folgt dann ein Vortrag von Dr. Ebenezer Satyaraj, PhD in Immunology, Immunologe und molekuläre Ernährungswissenschaftler, dessen Arbeit im Nestlé-Forschungszentrum von PURINA den Grundstein für den letzten Durchbruch im Umgang mit Katzenallergenen gelegt hat. Ein Thema, das ihm am Herzen liegt, da seine eigene Tochter allergisch auf Katzenhaare ist. Dr. Satyaraj wird die biologischen Grundlagen der Katzenallergie, das primäre Katzenallergenfeld D1 und den innovativen Ansatz von Purina zur Neutralisierung dieses Allergen mit Antifeld D1 Antikörpern vorstellen und damit den Besitzern helfen, ihre Belastung durch das Allergen einfach und sicher zu reduzieren. Und schließlich gibt es noch eine Präsentation der Liveclear Innovation, vorgestellt von Dr. Medved Claudia Wischer, Leiterin der wissenschaftlichen Innovation bei Nestlé Purina Pet Care Europa, Mittlerer Osten und Nordafrika und verantwortlich für das Projekt, das diese Ernährungsinnovation nach Europa brachte, der dietetische Ansatz zur Bekämpfung von Katzenallergenen. Die Präsentation werden in Deutsch oder in Englisch mit deutschen Untertiteln sein. Und um einen problemlosen Ablauf des Webinars zu gewährleisten, bitten wir Sie, Ihr Mikrofon während der Präsentation auszuschalten. Sie können Ihre Frage auf Englisch oder Deutsch direkt im Chat stellen. Die Antworten werden auf Englisch gegeben am Ende des Webinars. Und wir informieren Sie auch, dass das Webinar heute Abend aufgezeichnet wird, um später zur Wiederaufzeichnung zur Verfügung zu stehen. Und Sie werden den Link in Kürze per E-Mail erhalten. Kommen wir ohne weiteres zu den Präsentationen. Viel Spaß beim Webinar.
Guten Tag, ich freue mich sehr, Sie über Katzenallergie, eine häufige Ursache von Atemwegsallergien bei Menschen, etwas zu informieren. Mein Name ist Peter Schmidt-Grendelmeier, ich leite die Allergiestation am Unispital Zürich und bin daher praktisch täglich mit Patienten, die auf Katzenallergie leiden, konfrontiert. Allergien insgesamt sind ein sehr häufiges Problem. Und insbesondere Atemwegsallergien, dazu gehören die Katzenallergien, betreffen circa 1/4 der Bevölkerung. Daneben sind Nahrungsmittel, Medikamente und Insektengift wichtige Auslöser. Bei den Atemwegsallergien sicher der häufigste Grund sind Pollenallergien. Dann gefolgt von den sogenannten kleinen Tieren, den Hausstammilben. Und dann sind wir schon bei den Tierepithelien, wo zwischen 2 bis 10% der Bevölkerung daran leidet. Seltener, aber auch leicht verpasst, sind Allergien auf Schimmelpilzsporen. Das Haustierhalten hat für viele Leute eine große emotionale Bedeutung. Pet Love ist Endless Love. Und der Hund oder dann auch die Katze, das bedeutet für viele Personen, seines Familien, Kinder, aber auch Alleinstehende oder andere sehr viel und man hängt mit diesem Tier. Entsprechend sind halt auch Allergien auf Tiere ein wichtiges Thema. Es gibt ganze Bücher darüber, wie Sie hier sehen, Allergic to Pets, wie man damit leben kann. Und das heutige Symposium ist ja auch ausgerichtet mit einer sehr eleganten Methode, wie wir diesen Patienten etwas anbieten können. Es gibt fast nichts, was es nicht gibt bezüglich Haustierhaltung. Sie sehen oben links ein Frettchen, dann oben rechts einen Waschbären, unten links einen Leguan. Das sind alles Tiere, auf die wir schon Allergien bei unseren Patienten angetroffen haben, je nachdem, was die Patientinnen und Patienten verliehen haben. Und sie machen sich sehr unbeliebt mit einer Diagnose einer Tierallergie, wenn sie diese stellen und auch sagen, da müssen sie Medikamente nehmen und so weiter. Oder, was sehr natürlich nicht auf offene Ohren stößt, das weggeben, dann wechselt man eher den Arzt, als das Haustier wegzugeben. Also von dem her wissen wir, dass unsere diesbezüglichen Tipps hier wenig fruchten. Abklären würden wir solche Allergien auf Atemwege durch eine genaue Anamnese, also die Befragung, die Aufnahme der klinischen Symptome, Hautteste, Laborteste und Stationsteste. Hauttest funktionieren auf dem Pricktestverfahren. Das sind diese kleinen Fläschchen, die in der Lösung, zum Beispiel Katzenallergen drin haben. Wenn wir tropfen das auf die Haut, werden das ganz fein anritzen und bei einer entsprechenden Sensibilisierung eine solche Quaddel sehen. Zum Beispiel auf Katzenepithel, also können aber Pollen werden mit untersucht, andere Tierepithelien, Hausstammilben, Schimmelpilzsporen. Neben den Hauttesten haben wir Laborteste zur Verfügung, die ebenfalls sehr nützlich sind, sehr sensitiv und die eine Tierhaarallergie sehr sensitiv halten können. Das habe ich gezeigt. Wir können neben dem Hauttest auch zirkulierendes IgE im Serum messen. Hier ist das jetzt für Birkenpollen, zum Beispiel gegen Birkenpollen-IgE oder auch die molekulare Komponente. Das wäre beim Birkenpollen das BV1. Diese Struktur, die vom IgE-Molekül, das die Allergie vermittelt, erkannt wird und die mittels entsprechender Verfahren gut erfasst werden kann. Zu beachten ist, dass wenn wir IgE nachweisen im Hauttest oder im Labor, dass das noch nicht gleichbedeutend ist mit Allergie, sondern nur einer sogenannten Sensibilisierung entspricht, das heißt der Veranlagung, auf so einen Stoff allergisch zu reagieren. Die eigentliche Allergie ist definiert durch die klinischen Symptome bei entsprechendem Kontakt. Bei der Katze würde das heißen, dass wenn wir in der Bevölkerung IgE bestimmen, im Blut zum Beispiel, dass vielleicht 20% der Bevölkerung IgE haben, aber maximal die Hälfte dieser Leute hat auch Beschwerden bei Katzenkontakt. Dann spricht man von Katzenallergie. Wenn nur eine Sensibilisierung vorliegt, keine Beschwerden, sprechen wir von latenter Sensibilisierung. Neu können wir auch auf komponentenbasierter Diagnostik unsere Diagnose stellen. Das heißt, wir haben die einzelnen Eiweiße zur Verfügung, die in einem Extrakt vom Pollen, von Katze oder so drin sind. Und das hilft uns sehr viel besser, die Allergie zu finden. Tierallergie, ein wichtiges Thema, ein häufiges Thema, bislang oft auch ein bisschen unbefriedigendes Thema, weil wir einfach bei entsprechend nachgewiesener Tierallergie zum Weggeben des Haustiers raten mussten, aber was natürlich viele möchten. Wir haben sehr neue Erkenntnisse zu Tierallergien. zwar eine Arbeit, die schon 6 Jahre alt ist, von Kollegen aus Schweden und den USA, aber die doch gezeigt hat, wie viel mehr wir inzwischen auf Allergien auf Tiere, sei das nun Katze oder auch Kühe, Pferde oder andere Haustiere, wie unten rechts diese Ratte, festgestellt werden kann. Auch bei den Inhalationsallergien auf Tierhaare können wir molekulare Eiweiße bestimmen, also IgE gegen die Hauptallergene, zum Beispiel der Katze, das FeLD1, dann FeLD2, FeLD3, das kommt vom Felis domesticus und dann die Nummer, die zeigt, dass das das wichtigste oder zumindest zuerst beschriebene Allergen ist. Sie sehen, diese Allergene schwanken. Wenn die Katze da ist, sind die Werte in der Luft viel höher, als wenn sie nicht da ist. Ähnlich ist es beim Hund. Und Sie sehen auch, dass gewisse Stoffe, wie die sogenannten Lipokaline, bei Hunden und Katzen vorkommen. Patienten, die auf Lipokaline reagieren, werden bei praktisch allen behaarten Tieren, also Säugern, entsprechende Beschwerden haben. Das ist ein Protein, das bei den Säugern vorkommt. Patienten, die, ich sage es, nur auf FeLD1 sensibilisiert sind, die reagieren bei Katze, aber nicht bei Hund, da dort dann keine Kreuzreaktionen vorkommen. Insgesamt kann man diese molekularen Allergene heute sehr viel genauer spezifizieren. Wir haben ganze Listen, die uns helfen, diese Reaktionsmuster besser zu verstehen. Bei einer Sensibilisierung auf Katze können wir zum Beispiel FeLD1, aber auch FeLD4, das Katzenalbumin, FeLD2 bestimmen und ganz spannend FeLD5, ein Stoff, der mit Galaktose kreuzreagiert, etwas, was ganz irritierende Kreuzreaktionen auslöst, aber hauptsächlich ist es bei der Katzenallergie das FeLD1, das ist relevant für weitaus der größte Teil aller Katzenhaarallergien. Und Impfstrategien, Desensibilisierungsstrategien fokussieren sich praktisch immer auf das FeLD1, das wirklich zur überwiegenden Mehrheit bei den Patienten der Auslöser ist für eine Allergie auf Katzen. Dieses FeLD1 hängt ab ein bisschen vom Geschlecht der Katze. Wir finden es deutlich mehr bei Katern als bei Kätzchen, also bei Weibchen. Umgekehrt, wenn der Kater kastriert wurde, dann hat der kastrierte Kater weniger Allergen als die weibliche Katze. Das Allergen kommt vor allem im Speichel vor und in Talgdrüsen. Da die Katze sich aber dauernd reinigt, verteilt sie das auf dem Fell und das wiederum wird dann abgestrichen. Dieses Allergen ist sehr leicht, das schwebt also sehr lange in der Luft und ist umgekehrt sehr klebrig. Das heißt, eine Wohnung, in der eine Katze gelebt hat, finden Sie noch bis zu 1 Jahr später, auch wenn die Katze nicht mehr da ist, entsprechende Sensibilität, also Allergene, auch auf Kleidern, wenn die Katze beispielsweise um die Hosenbeine streicht, wenn Sie anschließend damit ins Tram gehen oder im Bus oder im Schulzimmer, ist da noch Allergen dran. Ich komme nochmal zu verschiedenen Sensibilisierungsmustern bei der Katzenallergie. Ich sehe, dass wenn jemand auf FeLD1, FeLD2 reagiert, kann er auch auf das Albumin in Hunden, Rindern oder Schweinen reagieren und dann hat er eben diese Kreuzreaktion. Dann gibt es noch das FeLD5, diese eben Galaktose 1,3-Galaktose, die zeigt wiederum ganz andere Kreuzreaktionen mit anderem Fleisch, mit vor allem rotem Fleisch und mit dem Cytostat, das in gewissen Ovarialkrebsmitteltherapien vorkommt. Wir haben das mal sehr schön zusammengestellt von Nadja Galliker, die Oberärztin bei uns auf der Allergiestation, die jetzt in Zürich in einer Praxis mitarbeitet, was diese Katzenallergie alles auch noch bewirkt. Über Kreuzreaktionen kann sie mit rohem Fleisch kreuzreagieren. Das sind die Patienten, die beispielsweise ein Barbecue machen, ein Steak auf den Grill werfen, das vielleicht nicht ganz durchgekocht ist und dann heftig reagieren, oft erst nach einigen Stunden. Zecken sind deswegen abgebildet, weil sie beim Zeckenbiss dieses Alpha-Gal, so heißt das kurz, über den Speichel, über ihren Stachel sozusagen in die Haut injizieren. Der Patient sensibilisiert sich dann auf diese Alpha-Gal-Fraktion, wird beim Genuss von rohem Fleisch in Zukunft eben allergische Beschwerden möglicherweise haben und allenfalls auch auf Katzen. Begonnen hat das Ganze mit einer Allergie auf den Stoff, den der Zweck beim Biss in die Haut injiziert, um Blut zu können. Eine weitere Kreuzreaktion, die ich schon angedeutet habe, ist diejenige auf Cetuximab Erbitux, das bei Ovarialkrebs zum Beispiel eingesetzt wird. Die Allergene sind vor allem im Speichel, etwas weniger im Urin, im Fell, aber der Speichel ist sehr zentral. Das trifft für die Katze zu, wäre auch beim Hund nicht anders, beim Pferd, da finden wir es im Schweiß und so weiter an anderen Orten. Aber Katzenallergien ist zum größten Teil primär im Speichel, wird dann über den Urin, respektive über das Ablecken der Katze des Fells, so weiter im Körper verbreitet. Wir können mit solchen Allergenen an verschiedenen Orten in Kontakt kommen, durch Inhalation, durch direkten Kontakt, selten auch durch einen Biss oder wenn wir Fleisch von diesen Tieren essen, was bei Katzen zumindest hierzulande ja nicht der Fall ist. Wir kennen auch zunehmend die molekularen Muster dieser Tierhaarsensibilisierung. Sie sehen, allein bei der Katze gibt es schon 8 allergene Komponenten vom Felde 1 bis Felde 8, die alle allerdings unterschiedlich gewichtet sind. Hier ganz kurz das Majorallergen. Die Definition besteht darin, dass das Allergen, das am meisten, also über 50% des IG bindet bei einem Patienten, deswegen Major. Manchmal hat es auch schlicht damit zu tun, das Allergen, das zuerst beschrieben wurde. Wie gesagt, können wir das zunehmend aufschlüsseln heute. Sie sehen hier allein schon bei der Katze die verschiedenen Muster, die alle eine große Rolle spielen. Und Sie sehen hier die molekulare Struktur dieses Felde 1, das halt in ähnlichen Strukturen im Körper anders vorkommt. Wir können IG gegen diese einzelnen Lipokarine messen, zum Beispiel das Felde 4, das mit dem Pferdeallergen, aber auch mit Mäuseallergen derselben Substanzklasse korreliert. Selten spielen Tierhaare eine Rolle als berufliche Allergene, beispielsweise bei Leuten, die im Labor arbeiten. Sie sehen das hier, wenn sie Lipokarin sensibilisiert sind, haben sie natürlich Mühe, mit Meerschweinchen, Ratten oder Mäusen direkten Kontakt zu haben, da diese inhalativ ihre Beschwerden wirken können. Man hat das auch breiter untersucht mit Endotoxin und Allergietests. Also vergessen Sie nicht ganz, auch beruflich sind einzelne Leute diesen Allergenen exponiert. Und dann gibt es Unterschiede zwischen Farmern und nicht als Farmer tätigen Personen. Das spielt mit hinein. Wenn jemand auf Katze allergisch ist, gibt es eigentlich nichts anderes als die Reservoire für die Katzenallergenen zu entfernen. Teppiche, Sofa, soweit das umsetzbar ist. Staubfilter sollten nur mit HEPA-Filter verwendet werden, weil dann das Allergen im Staubsauger drin haften bleibt. Und Sie können die Katze einmal wöchentlich waschen. Das reduziert den Allergengehalt. Allerdings wird die meisten Katzen das nicht so richtig wertschätzen und allenfalls eher ihren Arm zerkratzen, statt sich da demütig sozusagen einer Waschprozedur zu unterwerfen. Überhaupt hilft es bei Tierhaarallergien, wenn die Tiere vor allem draußen hilft. Bitte nicht ins Schlafzimmer, soweit man das einer Katze beibringen kann. Falls ein Katzenkäfig oder so eine kleine Liegestelle vor allem ist, sollte diese durch Personen gereinigt werden, die nicht direkt auf Katzen allergisch sind. Man kann die Katze, wie gesagt, auch baden, dadurch reduziert sich der Allergengehalt auf etwas. Ja, und dann findet man halt im Internet auch immer wieder Angebote, zum Beispiel wie die hypoallergene Katze, hypoallergene Hunde. Leider ist da nicht so viel, wie es weiß gemacht wird. Man kann den Allergengehalt etwas reduzieren durch Luftreinigungssysteme. Die laufen permanent, sind heutzutage auch nicht mehr so schrecklich anzusehen, wie zum Beispiel diese Geräte hier, und sind sehr effizient, zunehmend auch leiser, kosten aber immer noch einige 100 Franken, die im Einzelfall auch durchaus von der Kasse übernommen werden. Wir können auch desensibilisieren. Das hat sehr gute Erfolge bei Pollenallergien, bei Milben, und Sie sehen, bei Tieren nimmt es dann schon ab, kleiner 60%. Aktuell würde ich sagen, es ist maximal 50-50, was die ganze Desensibilisierung bei Tierallergien bringt. Die allereffizienteste Immuntherapie ist die mit der Biene und Wespe, die aber sehr viel länger dauert, die aber sehr wirksam ist. Da erreichen wir Behandlungsquoten bei bis zu fast 100% Beschwerdefreiheit. Bei den Pollen, da sind wir noch nicht ganz so weit bezüglich Frequenz, aber nichtsdestotrotz ist es eine häufige Allergie und ebenso eine gehäufige Indikation zur Desensibilisierung. Bei Tieren, dann komme ich dazu, dass ich Sie vom Allergiestation-Team wissen möchte und zur Immuntherapie noch einige Ausblicke geben möchte, die wir aktuell bei Katzen noch nicht zur Verfügung haben. Die Oralimmuntherapie oder epikutane Immuntherapie über Pflaster funktioniert zumindest im Kindesalter recht gut schon. Bei Erwachsenen sind die Erfolge eingeschränkt. Und dann sind Bestrebungen da, über Virus-like Partikel gegen Allergien zu impfen. Das ist die Gruppe von Professor Bachmann am Inselspital. Die packen das Allergen auf Virus-like Partikel, initiieren das. Das hat bei Erdnussallergie doch sehr schöne Erfolge schon gezeigt. Und Professor Bachmann hat mir gesagt, dass jetzt das nächste Allergen, das adressiert wird, werden das Katzen-Allergen, das dann durch die Desensibilisierung angegangen werden soll, was natürlich, wenn das wirkt, ein sehr großer Fortschritt wäre. Ähnlich wie das Produkt, das nochmal einen anderen Ansatz pflegt, wo wir die Katze sozusagen alle hypoallergen therapieren möchten, damit sie den allergischen Menschen nicht mehr Beschwerden auslösen kann. Auch das ein elegantes. Diese Resultate sind schon recht erfolgsversprechend und werden sicher bald noch geben. Ich danke Ihnen für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit und wünsche Ihnen ein geglücktes Leben. Nochmals mit einem Blick von meinem Team. Besten Dank.
Vielen Dank. Wir fahren mit dem restlichen Präsentation fort. Sie können Ihre Fragen noch jederzeit im Chatroom stellen.
So I'd like to begin just by saying a big thank you to Purina and the Purina Institute for giving me the opportunity of sharing with you today. And we're going to be looking at the impact of cat allergies on the cat and in particular the human-animal bond, the human-cat bond. So what I want to do with this presentation is just very briefly to look at pet ownership and that human-animal bond and the importance of the human-animal bond, and then why people choose to own cats, why people end up relinquishing cats on occasions to rehoming organizations in particular, and sometimes why rehoming of cats from a shelter ends up going wrong. And as you'll see as we go through this, cat allergies have an important role to play in all of this. First of all, we know that for both cats and dogs, the vast majority of pet cats and dogs that are kept in homes are considered to be a member of the family. Well over 90% of owners would say that their dog or their cat is simply a member of their family. That human-animal bond is extremely strong. It's based on the fact that there is unconditional love and affection that we receive from our pets. They provide companionship, they provide emotional support, and interestingly, the graph on the right-hand side there, that was a paper that was published in 2008, and it showed that more owners are secure in their relationship with their pet than they are with their partner. And I think that does speak to this unconditional love, the unconditional affection that we receive from our pets, which all of us that own dogs or cats know and recognize. It's interesting that studies have looked at the quality of the human-animal bond and compared dog ownership and cat ownership. Sometimes there have been differences that have been found, sometimes not. This was a study that tried to examine differences between dog owners and cat owners in their relationship with their pet. And interesting, they really found that there wasn't any difference in the quality of that human-animal bond, the companionship, the fact that it is something to love, affection that underlies this, the feeling that we get of being needed, of being loved, of being trusted by our dog or cat, the pleasure that we get from this. They found that there was no real difference between dog owners and cat owners with this. The quality of that relationship, the importance of that relationship is just the same, whether it's a cat or a dog. The only real differences between dog owners and cat owners comes when you ask questions that are more species specific. So, for example, does owning your pet make you feel safe? Well, not surprisingly, for dog owners, that's more commonly a yes than for cat owners. For dog owners, more often the ownership results in increased exercise. But if you take out those species-specific things, there's no real difference in the quality of that relationship. And that relationship is extremely important. Not only does it provide that love and affection that we desire, but it results in measurable improvement in physical and mental health characteristics as well. There are many reports of pet ownership and cat ownership increasing social support, very much like having a parent or a brother or sister, increased social support, increased feelings of self-esteem, increased happiness, and reduced feelings of isolation, reduced depression. In fact, in many countries where this has been studied, there is a significant reduction associated with pet ownership in visits to a healthcare professional and reduction in overall use of medication, and very good evidence from meta-analysis of data that pet ownership can improve cardiovascular disease and reduce hypertension. So there are health benefits from this as well. So with all of those benefits, you wonder sometimes why people don't own dogs and cats. And there have been studies that have looked at this. Why have you never owned a pet? Well, this is a study from American Humane Society that was published in 2012. They looked at 500 people that had never owned a dog or never owned a cat. And they asked them why they had never owned a dog or cat. And these were the reasons. Not surprisingly, some owners or some potential owners simply don't like dogs or cats. Their lifestyle is one where it would be difficult to have a dog or cat. But you can see there the third most common reason for not owning a cat was because they were allergic to cats, much more common than dogs. So cat allergy prevents some people from owning a cat in the first place. That study also asked people who had previously owned a dog or a cat why they no longer own that pet. So again, this was looking at 500 former cat owners, 500 former dog owners, and asking them why they no longer own a dog or a cat. And again, you can see that there are different reasons, as you would expect. Sometimes because the owner travels, sometimes because of the expense of owning a dog or cat, sometimes because they simply don't have time to look after a dog or cat. But again, you'll notice the fourth category there, being allergic to the cat, accounted for 16% of those former owners not now having a cat. Again, much higher for cats than dog owners. Allergy to the cat preventing them getting another cat. So Another way of evaluating the impact of cat allergies, is to look at reasons why people give up their cat to a shelter, why they surrender their pet to a shelter or a rehoming organization. And there have been a number of studies in different countries that have looked at this and looked at the reason. The first thing I would say, and this was highlighted by this particular study, this is a decision that most owners find extremely difficult to make. In this particular study, every owner that they interviewed and asked about it, they really struggled with this decision. Sometimes we think that for owners, it's an easy thing just to relinquish their pet to a rehoming organization. For most owners, that is not an easy decision. But you can see this was a study that combined both dogs and cats. The second most common reason for relinquishment was allergy, 18%. Didn't differentiate between the dogs and the cats in this particular study. So this was a study from Australia looking at cats that were relinquished to shelters, 33 different shelters across Australia, looking at nearly 50,000 different owners that relinquish cats. Variety of different reasons, as you would expect, for cats giving up their cats to these shelters, from inappropriate housing, number of animals that were in the house, financial reasons, behavioral problems. But in 3% of the cases, it was because of an allergy. The owner had developed an allergy to the cats, and that was the reason for relinquishing the cat to the shelter. This was another survey from Australia looking at shelters in 3 different regions. Quite a detailed study looking at 55 owners of cats and their reasons for giving up the cat. Again, having inappropriate housing was a common reason. Their circumstances had changed in the house, which meant they couldn't cope with the cat any longer, financial reasons. But as you can see, developing an allergy to the cats was responsible for 18% of those relinquishments. So really quite a high proportion. This was another big study from the UK this time, looking at over 6,000 cats that were relinquished to 11 rehoming centres, cats protection rehoming centres in the UK. Again, you can see variety of different reasons, change in circumstances, a litter of kittens that have been born that the owners weren't expecting and weren't wanting, and so they gave them up to the shelter, behavioral reasons. But again, owners developing an allergy to the cat was a cause in 8% of those cases of relinquishment. So a significant number of those owners had to give up the cat because they were allergic to the cat. And this is that study from the United States again, from the American Humane Association. They looked at 105 cats and 94 dogs that were relinquished to shelters, and they found that, in fact, development of a cat allergy in this study was the second most common reason for cats to be relinquished to a shelter. Again, a much higher rate with cats than with dogs. Only 2% of dogs surrendered because of development of allergy. Another large study from the States, 12 shelters, reasons for relinquishment of nearly 1,500 cats, 19% of them, development of an allergy, the owner or somebody in the house developing an allergy to the cat was the reason, 19%, third most common reason, again, much more common for cats than for dogs as a reason for relinquishment. So these give us an idea of the importance of cat allergy as a cause of needing to give up the cat from living in the household. Just very briefly as well, there are also some studies that have been done where cats have been rehomed from a shelter and then brought back to the shelter because that rehoming failed. Why did that fail? Well, this was a study from the UK. They looked at 166 cats that were returned to shelters after being rehomed. In 18% of those cases, the cat was returned because of an allergy of somebody in the house, allergy to the cat. This was carefully conducted study in the United States. This was University of Florida, where they had a group of cats that were involved in biomedical research, non-lethal studies. These cats were adopted out after the end of the studies. So over 450 cats adopted out. And they did a follow-up survey to see how successful that had been. Got results back from 275 of those cats. And most of them, 93%, stayed in their homes completely successful. 18 of those cats were relinquished. And again, the top 3 reasons for relinquishment of those cats: behavioral problems because it didn't get on with another cat in the house, behavioral problem because of inappropriate elimination, and in 17%, someone in the house was allergic to the cat. So you can see that cat allergy has a big impact on this human-cat bond, the human-animal bond. In around 5 to 20% of cases, allergy may be the reason for relinquishing a cat to a rehoming center, and it's often in the top 3 or 5 causes of relinquishment. 16% of previous cat owners cited allergy as a reason not to get another cat, and between 6 and 18% of people cited allergy as a reason not to consider getting a cat in the first place. So this does have a big impact. It should also be said, this is looking really at the tip of the iceberg. There will be many cases where people are allergic to cats where they don't actually eliminate cats from the household. They continue to live with the cat. In fact, surveys have suggested medical practitioners anticipate that only around about 30% of owners are likely to get rid of the cat when they advise it because they are allergic to the cat. Studies that have been done suggest actually the number is lower than that. These are 2 studies that I could find. One, only 22% of owners complied with the recommendation to get rid of the cat. Second study, only 4%. And again, this speaks of the quality of that human-animal bond. We don't want to give up the cat simply because we develop an allergy to the cat. But that will continue to cause problems. So we need to look at ways that we can minimize the impact of cat allergy in cases where humans continue to live alongside cats despite having a cat allergy. So thank you for listening, and I hope that's given you some useful insights.
Also, wir werden gleich zur nächsten Präsentation übergehen. Vergessen Sie nicht, Ihre Frage im Chat zu stellen, wenn nötig. Vielen Dank.
Hello. One summer evening, almost a decade ago, our daughter returned from a play date with her friend. And very quickly, my wife and I noticed that she had swelling in the eyes, watery eyes, redness, as well as some rashes. After a few frantic phone calls, both to her friend's mom as well as the pediatrician, we quickly realized that she had spent the better part of the afternoon playing with a new cat that her friend had adopted, and that she is allergic to cats. This instance started us on a journey, decade-long journey, that led to a scientific breakthrough for managing cat allergens that I'll be talking about today. My name is Dr. Ebenezer Sathiraj. I'm an immunologist, and I'm currently Director of Molecular Nutrition at Nestle Purina Research in St. Louis, Missouri. I lead a team of brilliant scientists who focus on trying to understand the relationship between nutrition and health at the molecular level. I started my career in academia, finishing a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Chicago in Chicago, Illinois, then moved on to Northwestern University to be on their faculty before moving into industry, the pharmaceutical industry, where I conducted research in the area of inflammation and disease. I came to Nestle Purina Research in 2003 with the goal of setting up a nutritional immunology program. And part of the work that I'm going to be talking about really came from the work that was initiated during that period. In my talk today, I will be starting by answering a fundamental question, which is what causes human allergies to cats? Then I'll move on and give you a quick overview of this novel nutritional approach that we'll be talking about. Then I'll finish up by walking you through several scientific studies that shows both the safety and the efficacy of the approach. So let's begin by looking at the problem. Cat allergy is a major problem. It's one of the most common animal origin allergies in humans. The numbers based on countries vary quite a bit, but worldwide, on average, 1 in 5 adults, which is about 20% of the adult population in the world, have some level of sensitivities to cats. And as you look at the data, the level seems to be increasing over time. Cat allergies has significant consequences both for humans and cats. For cats, it limits the interaction between the allergic person and the cat because people who have allergies tend to avoid interacting with the cat. Now, this can be extremely challenging for the cat as well, has consequences for the cat because although we think cats tend to kind of live by themselves, they do crave for interaction with their owners. The other way that cats can be impacted is that one of the most common recommendations that you'll get from your allergist if you're allergic and have a cat in the household is, can you remove the cat from the home to be able to help you with the allergies? It's one of the most gut-wrenching decisions for anybody to take, but therefore it's one of the most commonly provided reason for relinquishment of the cat. And finally, of course, it's a significant barrier to cat ownership and adoption. Allergies to cat also have consequences for humans. Allergies typically cause fatigue, poor quality of sleep, reduced alertness, lower productivity and concentration. There are significant side effects of the medication that people take to be able to manage their symptoms. And above all, there is this emotional toll. You have a pet, you love the pet is part of your family, a member of your family, and you're not able to interact with them as closely as you'd like because of your allergies, and that can be a significant emotional challenge for most individuals. So in a nutshell, cat allergies have consequences both humans and cats and have something that needs to be addressed. Let's move on to what is the primary protein or the allergen that causes cat allergies. Cats produce several allergens, but the most potent, the most common allergen that almost 95% of the cat allergic individuals respond to is to the protein feldiwan. Feldiwan is produced by all cats, regardless of breed, age, sex, weight, hair length, color pattern, etc. There are no truly hypoallergenic cats, and this is an important point that I like to emphasize. If you look at the cat on the picture, which is a hairless Sphinx cat, even they produce some level of feldiwan. And this is an important point for us to keep in mind because there is some mention about certain breed of cats to be very low allergenic. That is not true. What we know from the studies that we have conducted that is that even within a breed, cats produce different levels of feldiwan, and we will see a little bit of that in the next few slides. Feldiwan is primarily produced by salivary and sebaceous glands. There is some production both in the anal glands as well. But the primary protein that gets transferred to the hair is believed to come from saliva as part of the grooming process that all cats indulge in. As saliva gets deposited on the hair, it forms dander, which then gets released into the environment. Feldiwan is easily airborne and remains airborne for a long number of time as small particles. Feldiwan also tends to be an extremely sticky protein, so it tends to stick on to clothing. In fact, a study that was conducted in Sweden noted that even kids who do not have a pet at home, a pet cat at home, get exposed to a significant amount of FeLD1 protein because kids who have cats at home as pets tend to bring them into the school environment, attached to their books, to their clothing, to their coats, etc. In fact, studies have shown that even homes or buildings that are brand new, newly constructed building where no pets have ever lived, you can detect significant amount of FeLD1 because it gets tracked from the people who come to work in these buildings, construction crew, etc., tracking FeLD1 through their hair in their jackets and their coats and their shoes, etc. So it is a very ubiquitous protein that's present all over the environment, and that is something to keep in mind also as we think about solutions to be able to address that. So as I described earlier, we did a study where we evaluated 60 cats over a period of a year, looking at their salivary FeLD1 levels. And we had several interesting findings that I would like to quickly walk you through. So what you're seeing here are two representative cats from the study. And what you can immediately see is that although these cats are not particularly known to be low allergen breed, these are just domestic short hairs, you see that within that group of cats, there seem to be cats that have very low levels of FeLD1 and other cats that tend to have a very high level of FeLD1. The other interesting finding is that if you look at some cats as you follow over the year, there are some cats that tend to have their FeLD1 levels vary quite significantly during that period, and others not as much. So for instance, if you look at this particular cat, she started with a low of 4.2, but a high of 322. So there's a huge range of FeLD1 levels that she had over the period of a year. Whereas if you look at this particular cat, the level was much more tighter, only between 0.1 and 1 point. But this is interesting. Is if you look at some of the experiences that I've heard talking to people, I shared these results with a veterinarian at a meeting in Europe, and this veterinarian colleague of mine and her husband, who happens to be allergic to cats, foster cats for over 20 years. And she mentioned that in the 20 years or so that they've been fostering cats, there are a few cats that her husband did not have any reaction to at all. In fact, 2 of those cats, they ended up adopting and keeping them as part of the household. And when she looked at this data, she said, this might perhaps explain why my husband doesn't react to these cats, because perhaps they have very low levels to begin with. And this is an interesting insight and perhaps relevant to some of the experiences that you might have had as part of your practice or talking to friends. The most important last point that I want to make about FeLD1 is the fact that the biological function for FeLD1 is unknown. Therefore, the potential health and welfare effects of stopping its production are also unknown. And as you'll talk as part of the study that we have done, this is a hallmark of the approach that we have taken, in that the approach that we are proposing does not stop the production, does not alter the production of FeLD1, does not destroy the FeLD1. In fact, it retains the normal physiology of FeLD1 in the cats. Let's now move on and take a look at the current management strategies that people use to manage allergies. So what you're seeing here is the path that the allergen takes from the cat to the environment, and then people who are allergic to cats tend to get exposed to the allergen and then start developing allergic symptoms. If you overlay that with the management strategies people currently use, it again falls into 3 buckets: strategies that revolve around the cat, strategies that revolve around the environment, and strategies that revolve around the allergic individual. The 2 strategies that is commonly recommended today that revolve around the cat is relinquishing, which is removing the cat from the household, or avoiding interactions. Both of these are difficult to implement, as we will see in the subsequent slides. The second approach is trying to manage the environment, and this really involves a lot of cleaning to be able to keep the allergen levels low. In some cases, it involves changing to hardwood floor, removing carpet and replacing it with hardwood floor, washing or changing upholstery very frequently, all with the intention of trying to remove the amount of allergen that gets accumulated in a home that has a cat. The third sets of strategies revolved around the allergic individuals and really fall into two categories. One, strategies that prevent symptoms once the person is exposed to the allergen, and this involves primarily immunotherapy, where you prevent developing symptoms when you're exposed to the allergen. And then once you develop allergies and start having symptoms, you manage these symptoms by using medication. Let's quickly walk us through the limitations of the approaches that I described. Let's begin with approaches that revolve around the allergic individual. The two that we talked about are immunotherapy and treating symptoms of allergy. Immunotherapy, as you all know, can be costly and can involve long-term treatment, sometimes years. And interestingly, immunotherapy is believed to work effectively for certain allergens. But if you look at data for efficacy for cat allergies, the data is very limited. Most studies suggest that the efficacy for cat allergies tend to be very limited. If you look at people addressing the allergen by managing the symptoms, either they take prescription drugs or over-the-counter medication, all these involve drugs that are antihistamines or decongestants. All these tend to have significant side effects and, of course, the cost involved. The other key thing to keep in mind is that both these approaches only benefit the individual who is taking them. People who undergo therapy will have benefit. If you have symptoms, you need to take medication. So in a household where you have multiple allergy sufferers, each of them has to go through this process to be able to get the benefit. Let's move on to the environmental controls. And this typically involved, as we described earlier, cleaning, but also filters that can minimize the amount of allergen that gets recirculated in the household. These factors do tend to work in terms of reducing the allergen in the household, but they involve significant amount of effort. They're costly, and it is very hard to have long-term compliance because you need to be able to do this day in and day out as part of a regimen to be able to effectively manage allergen in the household. Then we go to approaches that revolve around the cat. And the two approaches that I talked about was one, removing the cat from the household, and the other one was avoiding interaction with the cat. Both these are extremely challenging for cat owners to involve in. If you talk to allergists, one of the most common recommendations they would give to their patients who has allergies to cat is to remove the cat from the household. And this is extremely gut-wrenching because the reason you adopt a pet is because you love pets. They're part of your family, and it is very hard to be able to give somebody away. In fact, talking to some of the allergists, one in particular who's a pediatric allergist, and her comment was, every time I have a mom or a dad bringing their child to me for evaluation, and I realize that following investigation that he or she has allergies to cat, and I suggest, can you give your cat away? The immediate reaction that I get is, how can I do that? Because that cat is my child's best friend, pet. It is going to be heart-wrenching for us to be able to give the cat away because it'll have a significant negative impact on our child. And in most cases, I'm pretty certain that this particular individual will never come to me. They will go and visit another allergist to get a second opinion. In fact, if you look at statistics, over 84% of people who have allergies to cat and have a cat in the household will refuse to give the cat away, but look for other solutions because it is a difficult decision for people to make. And of these, 20% would be more comfortable changing the allergist to get a different opinion rather than going with the recommendation that he or she would make. So that again talks about the bond that we have with our pets, and that is something important to keep in mind as we look at the overall impact of this problem. The other approach that some people have recommended is to bait the cat. Technically, baiting the cat removes the allergen from the hair and therefore is likely to reduce the amount of allergen that this cat is going to release into the environment. But baiting a cat is challenging. As you all know, cats are not dogs. Therefore, this is an approach that is not typically recommended. Let's now look at the approach that we will be talking about, and it is important to be able to really understand the journey of LD1 as as we get prepared to understand this novel approach and describe this novel approach. So what we saw so far is that Feldman gets secreted in the saliva. It then gets distributed through the hair during the grooming process and eventually enters the environment as shed hair and dander. We saw it stays up in the environment and gets released into the environment and gets sticking on to carpets, upholstery, clothing, and that's how it gets disseminated within the environment. What happens when somebody who's allergic encounters the Feldman is that it goes and binds to receptors that are present on the mast cell. These receptors are called as IgE molecules. So if a person is allergic to cat, they tend to have IgE molecules that are directed against Feldman. These IgE molecules are bind to mast cells that are distributed throughout the body. When Feldman molecule binds to these receptors on mast cell, it triggers a degranulation event that leads to the release of factors that results in the development of allergic symptoms. A great example of a factor like that is histamine. That's why when you have allergies, you take antihistaminic drugs. The other important idea that I want to kind of give you a quick overview and an understanding of is this concept of allergen load. Both these are important to understand the novel approach that we're talking about. Now, what you're seeing here is this red line kind of graphically describes a threshold above which, if the total amount of allergen goes above that, you start having allergic symptoms. If the allergen load remains below that, you do not have allergic symptoms for this particular individual. So let's start by building in the allergens that are commonly present in the environment. And as you all know, most people tend to have allergies to more than one particular allergen. So let's look at allergen layer. This is apparently present throughout the year in the household, spring, summer, fall, winter, etc. If you build in, you have allergen B, same situation present throughout the year. Allergen C, which is also present throughout the year. And if you combine the total allergen load, including allergen C, it is still below the threshold of the allergen. So you are not likely to have symptoms. This individual is not likely to have symptom at this stage. If you build in an additional allergen that goes on top of C, which is D, you can see at some points in the time your threshold goes above and you start developing allergic symptoms. Now, if you assume that, let's take for the example, as an example, if C is Feldman, if you're able to reduce the amount of allergen in the environment by how much allergen the cats are depositing into the environment, you're likely to keep the allergen load below the threshold for most of the year, and therefore likely to have a benefit. Now, again, I'm trying to explain this as a concept. This is very unique to each individual, the level of sensitivity, the different allergens that they're responding to. But the concept that I want to share with you here is that you want to be able to keep the allergen below a certain threshold to be able to have no or reduced symptoms. And the approach that we're taking is to be able to have a diet that I'll talk about that actually tries to do exactly that. So before we go on to the next part of my talk, where I'm going to give you a quick overview of this novel approach, let me recap the key things that we learned in the first part of my talk. Feldman is the key allergen that most people respond to. It's a protein that is produced in the saliva as well as sebaceous secretion, gets released into the environment through the grooming process, where Feldman is deposited onto the hair, dries, forms dander, and gets into the environment. An allergic individual has IgE molecules that are specific for Feldman that are bound to mast cells. And when Feldman comes in contact with this particular receptor, there is a degranulation event that leads to the release of factors that cause allergy. If we block the interaction and prevent the degranulation event, you're likely to have a benefit of not having those factors released. The final concept that we walked through was this idea of allergen load, where you want to be, the goal is to be able to keep the allergen level below a certain threshold for somebody not to have symptoms. And this is something that is also very unique for that person, for the environment they live in. But as a concept, the idea is to be able to reduce the allergen load in the environment. With that, let's quickly go into quick description of what this novel approach for managing FeLV1 is. So the goal of the approach for us was not to stop or alter the production of FeLV1 because, as we discussed earlier, its function is not clearly known for the cat, and therefore you do not want to interfere with this production or suppress its production, but to be able to look at an alternative way of trying to keep the levels of allergen in the household below a threshold where symptoms are less likely to happen. And we use an antibody technology, IgY, egg antibody technology, to be able to achieve that, and I'll quickly walk you through that. This is a technology that's been proven to be safe and effective for decades. So a couple of words about what is IgY technology. IgY is the avian equivalent of mammalian immunoglobulin. And egg-based IgY ingredients have been used for decades in the livestock industry, and now getting a lot of interest from the human dietary supplements. So it's a safe ingredient that's been used quite extensively in the food space, and this is the technology that we'll be using to try to reduce the amount of allergen that gets into the environment from the cat. So let's look at this video that talks about that describes our idea of using antibodies, egg antibodies directed against FeLV1 from binding and neutralizing FeLV1. So if you look at the video here, what you see here are these are two IgY antibodies that is specific for FeLV1 that tends to bind FeLV1, which is the protein that you see in the center. Let's look at that. That's your FeLV1 protein. These are IgY antibodies. So they have blocked and they have neutralized it. And this is what happens when a neutralized FeLV1 tries to bind to the IgE molecules that's present on mast cell. And what you're seeing here are the two IgE molecules that are depicted. This will be present on a mast cell. You can imagine a cell out there. Under normal circumstances, when the FeLV1 protein comes in contact with these, it will bind these epitopes, these green surfaces that is marked, lead to what's called as a cross-linking event, and that is what triggers the release of factors that causes symptoms of allergy. Look what happens when a neutralized FeLV1, in other words, a FeLV1 that's been bound by anti-FeLV1 antibodies derived from egg, tries to approach these two receptors. As you can see, the normal process of binding here is disrupted. It is no longer capable of binding to those receptors, and therefore incapable of eliciting a degranulation event, causing the release of factors that would cause symptoms of allergy. So that's the fundamental concept with which we started this work. If you put all that together in kind of a whole process flow, it starts by feeding cats a diet that's coated with egg ingredient containing anti-FeLV1 IgY antibodies. As the cats eat, this antibody gets released into the saliva, and it binds to the FeLV1 that is released into the saliva in the cat, and these antibodies neutralize the FeLV1. This neutralized FeLV1 is then transferred to the hair during the normal grooming process, and then when neutralized FeLV1 comes in contact with, it's unable to activate the key steps that are required to do a degranulation event. It's no longer recognized as an allergen when it's released into the environment. So that's the fundamental idea with which we started this work. I'm going to move on to the last part of my talk, where I'll walk you through several key studies that were done to be able to establish both the safety and the efficacy of the approaches. The studies that I'll be talking about fall into two categories, in vitro and ex vivo studies. These were studies that were conducted in the laboratory, and in vivo studies that were conducted in cats. In the in vitro and ex vivo studies, the primary goal of that whole series of work was to really establish that our hypothesis, which was an antibody neutralizing FeLV1, prevents FeLV1 from binding and activating a mast cell. We wanted to really prove that hypothesis with laboratory experiments. After having done that, we moved on to do studies with cats, where first we wanted to establish the safety of this approach for the cat. Then we did two studies where we were able to clearly demonstrate that feeding cats a diet containing anti-FeLD1 IgY clearly reduces the amount of active FeLD1 that's present in their saliva and on their hair. So let's begin with the first data slide. This is one of the various experiments that were conducted. The first set of experiments that I'm not going to be showing today clearly showed that you can physically prevent FeLD1 protein from binding human Ig molecules if it's neutralized with an anti-FeLD1 IgY antibody. What you're seeing here is that preventing that interaction has clear biological consequences. So let me quickly walk you through what we have here. What you're looking at is an experiment that actually measures the ability of FeLD1 and initiating a degranulation event, and our ability to show that if you neutralize the FeLD1, you're able to significantly reduce this degranulation event, which is the key hypothesis with which we started this idea. What you're seeing on the y-axis is the degranulation event that is depicted in these blue bars, and it's set at 100%. What you're seeing here is mast cells are binding to FeLD1, which is not neutralized, and you're clearly able to establish that there is significant amount of degranulation. You set that at 100%. Then you see what happens when you now challenge the mast cell with the FeLD1 protein that is neutralized. What you can clearly see is that you're able to prevent or reduce the degranulation process by as much as 60% when you're now challenging the mast cell with a FeLD1 molecule that is neutralized with anti-FeLD1 IgY. What you're seeing here are control experiments where if you use IgY that is not specific with FeLD1, you do not have any impact on reduction of degranulation event. So what this data, these sets of experiments clearly showed that the hypothesis which we started has significant merit in that if you prevent FeLD1 from binding to human Ig by neutralizing it using an anti-IgY antibody, you're clearly able to prevent the degranulation event that is required for the symptoms of allergies to happen. Having established that, we then moved on to do studies with cats. And the first study that we wanted to establish was the approach is safe for cats. And this is paramount in all the studies that we do as Purina, where we put the safety of the cat at the heart of all the work we do. As you all know, we are pet owners, we love cats and dogs, and we want to be sure that anything that we do above all has no negative impact for that. So this was a very crucial study for us to complete before we started the other studies where we could show the efficacy of the approach. Briefly, this was a 6-month study with 40 cats. Along with the control group, there were 3 other groups of cats that were fed levels that were many times higher than the levels of egg antibodies that were used in the efficacy studies. And during the 6-month period, we had a whole series of veterinary evaluations that were done. This included clinical evaluation. We evaluated body weight, food consumption, ophthalmic evaluation, blood chemistry, blood count, CBC, coagulation, urine analysis. There was also some behavior analysis done to see if there's any impact on the behavior of the cat. When we looked at the data after the 6 months of feeding, what we clearly demonstrated and noticed that there was no clinical difference between the control levels, where no anti-FeLD1 antibody were present, or any of the levels tested, clearly showing that this approach is perfectly safe for cats. This was work that was published late last year in the journal Frontiers in Veterinary Science. So having established the safety of the approach for the cat, we went on to do our first study where we asked the question, does the approach reduce the amount of active FeLD1 in the saliva of the cat? For this study, we selected cats that had moderate or higher levels of FeLD1 expression so that we can measure FeLD1 reduction in these cats. There are some cats, as we saw earlier, that have very low levels to begin with. And if you include them in a study, if those levels are slightly above or below the level of detection of the ELISA, you really cannot show a decrease. So therefore, those cats are eliminated from the study. Saliva samples are collected 5 hours after the morning feeding, and the amount of active FeLD1 was measured using an ELISA kit. and this was evaluated as weekly averages. Now, let me tell you a little bit about what I mean by active FeLV1. The ELISA kit uses the same approach where the FeLV1 antibody has to bind to the capture antibody in the kit to be able to detect. A neutralized FeLV1, which is unable to bind to human Ig, is also not able to bind to the captured antibody in the ELISA assay, and therefore the ELISA assay can only detect free FeLV1. In other words, neutralized FeLV1 cannot be detected, and therefore what I'm referring to active FeLV1 is FeLV1 that is still remaining in the saliva of the cat that is not bound by anti-FeLV1 IgY and therefore not utilized. When we looked at the data from the study, each cat served as its own control. And here are results from the study. What you're seeing here is weeks on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, you're looking at mean change from baseline from the statistical model that was used to evaluate the data. And what you can see is that while you do see a decline in the control group, there was a statistically significantly greater decline seen in the test group starting from week 3. In fact, you got a 24% reduction of active FeLV1 in the saliva of these cats starting from week 3 onwards. This was work that was published also last year in the Journal of Feline Medicine and Surgery. Having established the fact that the approach that we started with can clearly reduce the amount of active FeLV1 in the saliva of the cat, we went on to ask the question, what happens to the amount of active FeLV1 in the hair of the cats? So here's the summary of the findings from the study. So the first proof of concept study clearly showed that feeding a dry cat food coated with anti-FeLV1 IgY significantly reduced active FeLV1 in the saliva of the cat, starting with the third week of feeding. Having done this, we went on to ask the question, what happens to the amount to the hair FeLV1 levels? And for this, we designed the study to be able to ask the exact same question, which is, can a diet containing anti-FeLV1 antibody reduce the amount of active FeLV1 in the hair of this cat? This was a much larger study where we had 105 cats that were fed a controlled diet for 2 weeks, followed by a test diet for 10 weeks. Hair was collected by brushing the front, shoulder, and sides of this cat. Active FeLV1 was measured using the same ELISA assay that I described earlier and was evaluated as weekly averages, and each cat served as its own control. Here are the results from the study. What you're seeing on the y-axis is the weeks baseline and week 1 to week 10. On the y-axis, you're looking at the absolute FeLV1 levels in these cats here. And what you can clearly see is that, again, there is a decline starting from week 1 and week 2, but starting week 3, you start seeing a dramatic decrease in the amount of active FeLV1 that can be detected in the hair of this cat, and that lasts almost until the end of the study. This work was also published earlier last year in the journal Immunity, Inflammation, and Disease. If you look at the data overall, 97% of the cats showed reduction of FeLV1 levels as compared to the baseline. 86% of the cats showed a reduction of 30% or greater, and 50% of the cats showed a reduction of 50% or greater. And let me put that in context for you. What this shows us that the approach of feeding a diet containing anti-FeLV1 antibodies is clearly able to reduce the amount of active FeLV1 in the hair by as much as 50% based on the data that we have from the study. And that is kind of denoted here. If you look at the average reduction over the period from week 3 to week 10, there was an average reduction of about 40%. Clearly showing that you're able to reduce the amount of active FeLV1 by almost 50% once these cats get onto the diet containing anti-FeLV1 antibodies. Let's go back to what we started here, because both these studies clearly shows that the approach of trying to use an anti-FeLV1 antibody as part of the diet is able to reduce the amount of active FeLV1 both in the saliva and in the hair. And as you saw in the last slide, there's a dramatic reduction of the amount of active FeLV1 that is detected in the hair. And if you connect that with the earlier idea of trying to reduce the amount of allergen in the environment below a threshold, this is clearly has the potential to be able to deliver that. So if you go back to the slide that we started, where we were looking at the current management of cat allergies, approaches revolving around the cat, approaches revolving around the environment, and then approaches around the allergic individual. What we're proposing is another approach that can be added to this overall strategy to be able to reduce the allergen level that eventually gets into the environment. What's unique about the approach, as we saw in the studies that I described, is that not only is it safe and effective, but it's also very simple to use. Because if you look at the earliest approaches, relinquishment avoidance, challenging for an individual to adopt. Cleaning, extremely tedious, hard to be able to keep maintaining. And of course, approaches that involve the allergic individual, you have to have significant investment in time and effort to be able to get those benefits. The approach that we are proposing is simple in the sense that you have to just feed the diet. You don't have to do anything else. And the active ingredient in the diet is able to deliver the benefit of reducing the amount of active LD1. So not only is it safe and effective, but it's also extremely simple because you don't need to change any other routine that you need to do as part of the approach to manage the allergens in the environment. So the scientific breakthrough that I'm so excited to share with you and walk you through these slides is really a part of a comprehensive allergy management plan. And we believe this approach can reduce cat allergens while importantly keeping the cat in its loving home, which I know is extremely important for people like me as well as others who love their pets. So let's quickly summarize the key points that we discussed during this presentation. So the innovation delivers specific anti-FeLD1 antibodies, also called as IgY, in an egg product ingredient that is coated onto the cat's kibble. The anti-FeLD1 IgY is safe, and it effectively neutralizes active FeLD1 in the mouth of the cat as the cat chews the food. As cat grooms, the neutralized FeLD1 is transferred to the cat's hair. Neutralized FeLD1 is no longer recognizable as an allergen when released into the environment. And most fundamental to this approach is that the normal FeLD1 production is maintained and cats' overall physiology is not impacted. Thank you very much for your attention.
Und nun die letzte Präsentation. Ich sehe, dass es gibt bereits einige Fragen, aber zögern Sie nicht, wenn Sie weitere haben, diese in die Chat zu schreiben.
Ok, suite à la présentation du Dr Ebenezer Satiraj, j'ai le plaisir de vous présenter le résultat de plus d'une décennie de recherche, la gamme de produits ProPlan Liveclear. ProPlan Liveclear est un nouvel aliment révolutionnaire pour les chats. Le premier et le seul aliment qui réduit les allergènes sur les poils et les squames du chat. Le concept est fondé sur les résultats de toutes nos recherches qui viennent d'être présentées. Pour résumer, nous savons que tous les chats produisent allergènes FeLD1, quelle que soit leur race, leur âge, la longueur ou la couleur de leur poil, leur sexe ou leur poids. L'ingrédient clé de ProPlan Liveclear est une protéine spécifique issue de l'œuf. Lorsque les chats mangent cet aliment, la protéine neutralise FeLD1 dans la bouche du chat. En réduisant le FeLD1 actif dans la salive du chat, cela réduit l'allergène qui est transféré sur les poils lors de la toilette du chat et à terme réduit l'allergène dans l'environnement. Lorsqu'il est donné quotidiennement, ProPlan Liveclear réduit considérablement les allergènes sur le poil des chats dès la 3e semaine d'alimentation. La gamme ProPlan Liveclear couvre chaque étape de vie du chaton au chat adulte et senior. Elle sera disponible en Suisse à partir d'avril. Les recommandations habituelles d'utilisation s'appliquent également à Pro-Plan Liveclear. Il est important de répartir la ration journalière sur plusieurs repas au cours de la journée. Et comme tout changement de régime alimentaire, il est recommandé à vos clients d'effectuer une transition en douceur. Spécifiquement à Pro-Plan Liveclear, pour obtenir une efficacité optimale, il doit être donné quotidiennement, doit être la source d'alimentation principale du chat et doit être conservé dans un endroit frais et sec. Pro-Plan Liveclear n'a pas pour vocation de remplacer d'autres stratégies de réduction des allergènes, mais ajoute une autre dimension qui peut aider à réduire la charge des allergènes dans les foyers possédant un chat. Grâce à cette approche révolutionnaire de la gestion des allergènes du chat, la qualité de vie des chats et des familles qui les aiment pourrait être enrichie par un contact plus proche que jamais. Merci.
Also vielen Dank. Ich sehe, dass es gibt jetzt viele interessante Fragen. Ich werde die Fragen für die Referenten übersetzen, wenn nötig. Aber jetzt eine erste Frage, und ich glaube, es ist für Professor Grendelmeier. Gibt es einen Schnelltest, um Feldi-1-Allergie zu identifizieren, damit man es testen könnte, bevor man eine Katze nach Hause nimmt und sie dann nicht wegen Allergie wieder weggibt?
Hören Sie mich?
Ja, perfekt.
Ja, gut, okay. Es gibt Tests, um Feldi-1 nachzuweisen. Ein Schnelltest ist mir noch nicht bekannt. Aber ich weiß auch nicht, wie zielführend das wäre, da wir ja gehört haben, dass der Gehalt von Feldi-1 doch recht variabel ist über Tage, von Katze zu Katze, Jahreszeiten und so. Aber mir ist ein Schnelltest nicht bekannt. Hingegen, wenn man Zeit hat, dafür das nachzuweisen, dann ist das kein Problem.
Okay, vielen Dank. Nächste Frage, or next question. Can neutering the cat reduce the amount of allergens? That would be for Dr. Sparks or Dr. Satyaraj.
Andy, do you want to take that, and I can join in after?
Sure, happy to. So yes, we know that entire male cats produce more FeLD1 than either neutered males or female cats, irrespective of whether they are neutered. So neutering a male cat will certainly help to reduce FeLD1 levels. So that will make a difference, and some of the recommendations about managing cat allergy within the house do involve making sure that you don't have entire male cats there. But of course, it's not going to reduce FeLD1 production to zero. They will still be producing FeLD1, so there's still going to be the possibility of allergic reactions. Ebenezer.
Yeah, just to build on that, I think there's been a couple of published studies that have clearly demonstrated that neutering tends to reduce the FeLD1 levels in male cats, but to the point that Dr. Sparks made, it never brings it down to zero. There's always be some production level, but generally lower.
But I can add from a clinical side, it really, if you reduce the FeLD1 content in a room by castrating a male cat or reducing it by nutrition, it really helps to the patient. So it has an impact.
Thank you for that, Dr. Schmidt, because that is one thing that I've heard, and I'm not a human allergist, I'm an immunologist, but in all the conversations that I've had with colleagues from your field, that's one thing that's universal. Reducing the amount of allergen reduces exposure and likely reduces symptoms.
Fully agree, voll einverstanden.
Thank you very much. Also another question, do we know why there is more FeLD1 in certain cats than in others? Has there been a connection shown between a certain breed, for example?
Let me take that. That's a great question, and one of the earlier studies that we tried to do was to really understand, is there some correlation between different kinds of coat color, age, gender. In the study that we did, we were not able to identify any correlation between any of these factors, age, gender, coat color, indoor, outdoor, to impact the level of FeLD1. And I don't believe in my purview of the literature there is any clear direction as to what drives the difference between FeLD1 levels from one cat versus the other.
May I again add something from what I know from clinical study? It's absolutely correct what you say. There's no difference between different breeds of cats. In contrast to different breeds of dogs, there are differences, but they are also much more different than cats are. So breeds doesn't seem to have an impact.
Absolutely correct. Yes.
Great, thank you.
Even
yes?
Those breeds, I can just build. Even there are some people talk about certain breeds that tend to have very low levels. Published literature, what we have seen, all cats produce some level of FeLD1.
Absolutely. Actually, there was even some cheating in the web selling FeLD1 free cats, which was just a good marketing argument. But also these cats had FeLD1 in their saliva.
And since we mentioned shortly dogs, is there any experience also regarding dog nutrition and allergies to dogs?
It's an area that we have looked at. Dog, as Dr. Schmidt pointed out, dog allergen tends to be a little different, tends to be more on the hair rather than the saliva. So there are other approaches that could be looked at, but at the moment there is not a huge focus on our end to be able to do anything in that space. This is an area that we're exploring.
All right. Then we have a couple questions regarding the IgY. So you mentioned that they were already used in the food industry. Could you bring some examples?
Absolutely. So the IgY technology has been in use since the 1970s. And what is unique about this technology is that you're able to add an ingredient that is part of our diets for millennia to be able to deliver antibodies against specific targets. It's been quite extensively used, for example, in the animal feed industry, raising fish. Recently, there are great examples of products being available as human supplements that can target potentially toxins or some pathogens in the GI tract. So in a sense, it's a technology that is very suitable for a food application. It has a safe history of use, has been used widely in various applications in the food space to be able to deliver these kinds of benefits.
Great. So I think it answers also the next question, which was how it was used in the livestock industry. Another related question was, in what form does IgY is present in the egg? Maybe Dr. Imhoff would like to elaborate on that because he asked the question. But in what form is IgY present in egg?
Do you want to go ahead and answer that? Yes. Let me explain, and then we can open up for discussions. Unlike the other mammalian immunoglobulins, you have IgG, IgM, IgA. There are different types of IgGs. I'm not sure that there are multiple variations of IgY that's been identified. This is this immunoglobulin that accumulates in the yolk. And it seems to have the unique ability of transferring maternal antibodies to the young ones in the avian species, so that they are born with a full complement of antibodies to protect themselves from pathogens that are likely to be exposed to in the environment. In that sense, it serves the same purpose as colostrum. Does that answer the question?
All right, I'll see, and if it doesn't, please ask more questions in the chat. There was another question. The inclusion of IgY in a dog's diet has shown effects on microbial fermentation in the gut. Has this also been seen in cats or not?
I have to go and look back at the publication that you're specifically talking about. Here we are talking about an egg antibody that is very specific to a protein that cats secrete in the saliva. It's likely that the antibodies that they're talking about may be antibodies that are directed against specific microbiomes. So I don't know the study specifics, so I can't comment. One thing I'd like to make clear is one of the unique things about IgY in this context is that once the diet is eaten, that IgY protein, some of it is obviously going to be swallowed by the cat. As soon as it enters its GI tract, it's going to be treated like any other protein. Just like what happens when you eat, for example, a sunny side up egg in the morning for breakfast. The antibodies just get digested out as a great source of protein.
All right, thank you. Next question: how and when exactly, where exactly in the body do FeLD1 and IgY come into contact?
That's a very important question. It really goes to the heart of the mechanism that we are hypothesizing and have shown in the results to be able to significantly neutralize FeLD1. The interaction primarily happens only in the oral cavity. So as I described in my presentation, and other presenters also alluded to that, FeLD1 gets secreted into the saliva along with the salivary secretions. The antibody against FeLD1, which is the IgY that is released into the oral cavity through the diet, binds to FeLD1 in the oral cavity. It's actually a physical interaction that happens there. And then what happens is follows what happens to proteins present in the saliva, which get then transferred to the coat during the grooming process. And therefore, what now ends onto the coat and eventually into the environment is FeLD1 that is bound by IgY and neutralized, unable to interact with the human machinery. Whatever FeLD1 is then swallowed, or the IgY that is swallowed, I mentioned in my earlier response, is going to be digested like any other protein. So the binding critically happens in the oral cavity. It's a physical interaction between FeLD1 and IgY. And most importantly, it doesn't impact the production of FeLD1. It doesn't destroy the FeLD1. It doesn't in any way suppress FeLD1 production because it's only a physical interaction taking place in the oral cavity of the cat.
Thank you. That was really clear. Does the feeding frequency or amount have an influence on the efficiency of the diet?
So all the studies that we have conducted have been cats that have fed the diet once a day. And using that information, when we formulated the diet, they were also formulated such that there is sufficient amount of active ingredient delivered if you feed the cat this diet on the feeding protocol, the feeding instructions that comes with the product bags.
Okay. And does it have an effect if the cat also eats wet food in addition to this dry food, or is it better to feed only the dry food?
I'll make a comment and I'll perhaps have Dr. Wisher also to add into that. Most people I know do treat their cats with some amount of wet food. That I think if you add a certain amount as a treat, that should be okay. But if you have a huge, significant amount of the intake for the cat happens to be a wet food, which obviously will take away from how much dry food this cat is going to be consuming, that is likely to have an impact because ultimately it's a question of delivering enough egg antibodies to the oral cavity to bind and neutralize sufficient amount of IgY to bring about the effect. I'll let Dr. Wisher respond.
I mean, I can just build on that comment where really the recommendation is that that ProPlan Liveclear is the principal diet of the cat. But as Dr. Satiraj just mentioned, it is okay to give some wet as a treat here and there. But we really do know that to deliver the required amount, you need to follow the feeding guidelines, and the cat needs to consume that amount to see the efficacy that we've demonstrated in our studies.
Great. And also to follow up with this question, is there also a Liveclear wet food that is planned?
We are not focusing on that, but again, I'll let Dr. Wisher respond to that.
Yeah, so for now, we're definitely focused on the dry food. The egg yolk powder is actually contained in the coating that's basically around the dry kibbles, and it is quite challenging to add these type of ingredients to the wet food, particularly given the processes used to manufacture the wet food, where there can be damage to some key nutrients. So for now, we're really focusing on the dry food.
Thank you. And how does it look when the cats gobble down the food, like the one of that asking the question? Does the food still work? If they're not chewing it. We're not. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, it's much better.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, in all the studies that we have conducted, I've described 3 studies. The studies included cats with different kinds of feeding behavior. Some gobble, some eat. And on average, what we were able to clearly demonstrate is that we do significantly reduce the amount of active feldiman in these cats. So in that, taking that into context of what people will experience in their homes, you're likely to have the benefit. In other words, let me put it differently. The feeding behavior on the dry food is not going to make a huge impact on the behavior of the egg antibody reaching the oral cavity and binding the feldiman protein.
All right. Other questions? Let me check. Do you also plan to do human studies that show that a reduction in FeLD1 has an effect on allergy in humans? That would be a question for all of you.
Let me take that, and I'll open up for the others to comment as well. Human studies, as you know, are pretty challenging in the allergy space. And again, to be clear, I'm not a human allergist. I'm an immunologist. So the conversations that we have had, that's been one of the feedback that we have received. So we have not focused on doing human studies. The work that we have concentrated clearly is to be able to demonstrate the ability of this FeLD1 reduction once these cats are fed the diet. But there have been some colleagues of ours who have conducted a study with a small human proof of concept study that was conducted using a chamber system where you can have a much more controlled environment. And this study's details about that are available at the Purina Institute website, and you can find information around that. Beyond that, we are not at the moment planning or considering any human studies.
Thank you. Will anyone also wish to answer?
Yeah, maybe I can comment. I think it's really a very elegant approach, and because as you said, it's just neutralizing the FeLD1 that is excreted into the saliva. So I'm quite optimistic that our patients will benefit of it. And as you said, like reproducing it in a chamber, or even just observing patients who have cat allergy during a while might be okay, because it would really add on something to this, in my eyes, really very elegant product.
Thank you. Another questions. 2 years ago, there was an approach to a vaccination for cats, which produces an antibody reaction with neutralization of the allergen. Can you say something about this?
So we have heard about that approach, and the only information that we have regarding that approach was the paper that was published, and there they were able to show with a vaccine approach a certain amount of reduction. Beyond that, we have no insight as to the next steps that they're proceeding. But one thing I'd like to, however, highlight is that the approach that we're taking is very, very different. One, you're not exposing the cat to an antigen and enabling it or making it to make an antibody against it, which in this context would be a an antigen against a self protein. Our approach is very simple, very different, where you're trying to deliver a preformed antibody in the IgY format to the oral cavity, bind the FeLD1 protein once it is released into the saliva, neutralize it, and that gets transferred into the environment. In that sense, this is a completely different approach without involving anything to do with the cat, without interfering with the production of the FeLD1, suppressing the production of the FeLD1, or destroying the FeLD1. So that's the clear difference in the approach that we have taken. And that's something worth highlighting from a safety perspective.
I can add on. It was one of the papers I cited in my talk with the virus-like particles. As I said, it's really a complete different approach. It's neutralizing the antibody within the body of the cat. The end result is really that if there's less FeLD1, the patients benefit. This could be shown in a small study. So it underlines also that reducing FeLD1 is useful. But I know there were limitations in regarding of, for example, from animal protection, because you don't know what really happens to a cat which has no FeLD1 on long term. So they had to overcome quite some hurdles.
All right, thank you. And there was a last question, I think, is when will Liveclear be available in Switzerland? And it will be available as of mid-April, ab Mitte April. I think I have seen all the questions. Thank you very much for all the insights and answers. Wenn es keine weitere Fragen gibt, werden wir die Webinar schließen. Das Webinar wurde aufgezeichnet und wird später zur Wiederholung zur Verfügung stehen. Sie erhalten den Link in Kürze per E-Mail. Gibt es noch Fragen? Ich glaube nicht. Vielleicht, I see someone is typing, but I don't see the question yet. Otherwise, if there are more questions, we can still transfer them and then send an answer per email. Again, thank you very much. Nochmal vielen Dank an Professor Peter Schmid-Kandelmeier, Dr. Andy Sparks, Dr. Ebenezer Satyaraj und Dr. Claudia Wischer für die Präsentationen heute Abend. Und vielen Dank an Sie für Ihre Teilnahme. Und wir wünschen Ihnen einen schönen Abend und auf Wiedersehen. And thank you very much again.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Have a good evening. Schönen Abend.
Thank you.
War sehr interessant.
Ja, sehr interessant. Vielen Dank.